And now let me introduce our speaker, Dr. Paula Adams. Dr. Adams specializes in comparative politics, specifically the study of the politics of Europe at the Pitt Greensburg campus, because the U.S. politics is just not enough to keep you busy, right?
My colleagues do American politics, I do the other 194 countries in the world, and yet we're paid the same. Unfair.
He has taught courses on comparative politics with focus on election systems and how such systems impact voter choice, turnout, political party competition, and voter satisfaction. Dr. Adams is affiliated faculty of the Jean Monnet European Union Center of Excellence and the Center for European Studies at the University of Pittsburgh in Oakland. And Dr. Adams has numerous publications and is currently working on a manuscript on the governance of Northern Ireland in the post-Brexit environment. Again, because you're not busy enough. The League is also happy to have Paul serving as the Director for Civic Education in our league in Westmoreland County. Proof positive that men can join the league. So, Paul, I hand it over to you.
It also proves that some people have a problem saying no when offered many opportunities. So, thanks everybody. Thanks for coming. So, so today I want to talk about ranked choice voting, but I want to do it. I'm a comparative political scientist. We compare institutions and things across countries and political systems. So for me, it's not a matter of how you study something on its own. I don't know how people do that. You have to compare it to other things. Some people say I'm tall, and I'm, well, compared to who? If the Boston Celtics walked in here, I'm not. Right? If a bunch of fourth graders walked in here, I am. So comparative matters a lot. And so when we talk about ranked choice voting as an option for voters and how we elect members of Congress, state house, local governments, we have to compare that to other systems, most notably the one we use already. So we're going to kind of begin with what we have across most of the United States, here in Pennsylvania, right here in congressional and state house and state senate districts, right here in the Commonwealth. We use what's called a single-member district system. The single-member district system is actually one of the more common election systems used in the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, historically in New Zealand, Britain, but even France uses a single-member district system as well. And so this is where you take the country, take the political system, and divide it up into geographic constituencies. In the U.S. House of Representatives, we have 435 districts representing each of the members of Congress. It hasn't always been 435, it's been lower. When we add states, we tend to add more seats. So there's nothing actually in the Constitution that states how many there are. Congress actually can change that as it deems fit to increase the size of the body. Britain uses the same system. They have 650 what are called constituencies. In Canada, they're called ridings, but same process. You divide the country into a bunch of districts. Each of those districts elects one person and one person alone to go serve in the legislature to represent that geographic territory and its population. So because it's one person per district, in election lingo and jargon, we say that's a district magnitude of 1. So one person per district. So every district only gets one seat only to go serve all the people that live in that particular district. There are really three main versions of single-member district systems. First is called first past the post. That's what we use here in Pennsylvania. That's what's broadly used in Canada, the UK, and most of the United States. So first past the post system is you have an election with as many candidates that are on the ballot as there are. Whoever gets the most wins. The most, not a majority necessarily. You could have 10 people running for a congressional seat, and maybe the person with the most only has 17% of the vote. They win the seat. It's a plurality system. It's not based on majority, 50% plus 1. This happens fairly frequently, especially when we have third parties that take a share of the vote. It happened much more frequently prior to World War II. If you actually look in a lot of areas of sort of the Great Lakes and the Midwest, lots of congressional seats, the person won it with 34, 35, less than 40% of the vote regularly. So that's called first past the first. The first person that passes that imaginary line with the most votes wins the seat. The second version is called a two-ballot or runoff system, in which you have an election among however many candidates. If nobody gets 50% plus one, you have a runoff election. And typically that's between the top two vote getters. And so you hold another election, maybe it's a week later, maybe it's a month later, depends. In France it's a week, in Georgia it's a month, and just between the top two. Now the advantage there is somebody's gonna get 50% on that second ballot. You'll have a clear majority winner, but that's typically what this is trying to do, is force a majority winner, or at least eliminate some of the lowest vote getters, and then have another election in which the person's more likely to have a larger share of the vote to represent those people in districts. And we'll talk about kind of Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi's two-ballot system a little bit, and runoff system a little bit. Then there's sort of this other example called the alternative vote. That's what they call it in Australia. They use that to elect their House of Representatives. Or what we typically call here in North America, ranked choice voting, RCV. So Australia is probably the country that's most notable for using this on a nationwide level for their lower house. Here in the United States, the two states that are most notable for using it are Alaska and Maine, both of whom have adopted it within the last 15 years. So a number of other states are actually looking this year to potentially adopt, depending, they're gonna have a referendum later this year in Nevada. Actually, it'll be the second one, and if that passes, it'll come into effect in Nevada in 2026. So ranked choice voting is essentially you rank candidates in order, and if nobody gets 50% plus one majority support on the first ballot, you start eliminating people with the lowest vote getters and count what their second preference was. We'll get into some of the mechanics in a second, but the interesting thing is states can pick any of these in the United States. The Constitution does not specify that you have to use one of these. It does specify that it has to be district-based, which does create some limitations, but constitutionally, states and their citizens are free to pick among these three choices, and there's lots of wrinkles even within these choices. We'll see that as we get to some of the options that have been undertaken. So there's nothing unconstitutional about a ranked choice voting system or a runoff system. The US Constitution pretty clearly states that states have to be divided into districts, but past that, states have wide latitude to choose the kind of system they want. So a little bit more about the system we currently have here in Pennsylvania and across most of the United States. It's also sometimes called a winner-take-all, because if you win that election, even with 35 or 40% of the vote, you win 100% of the seat, one seat. So it is sort of a kind of a maximum award, even if you don't get 50% of the vote. Whoever gets the most percent of the vote gets that one and only seat. You have to have a plurality to win, so not a majority. This originated in the UK. The House of Commons has used this historically for a long time. Lots of other countries did as well. Not surprisingly, the US and Canada adopted a very similar model historically. Most US states use a first past the post system for congressional as well as their state House and state Senate seats. Technically, this is how the Electoral College works too, right? We divide the country into states. Each state gets a certain number of electoral votes, but it's winner take all. You win the state, you get all the electoral votes, except in Nebraska and Maine, because they're weird. They are weird, actually, in a lot of key ways. Maine and Nebraska have weird things, in which they actually divide up the electoral vote. Whatever candidate, Nebraska only has 2 congressional districts, but then they have 4, I think it is, total electoral votes, because you always have 2 more. So whoever wins each district wins one of the electoral votes, and then whoever gets the most statewide gets the bonus too. Maine's very similar in that way. So as an example of how this works, I picked an election from 2022. Colorado's 8th district, which is just a little bit north of Denver, including some of the suburbs and parts of Denver actually now. This was a majorly redrawn district. Colorado got an additional seat after the 2020 census, so they had to redraw all the election maps. This is a pretty competitive seat. The area towards Denver is more Democratic. As you move north towards Greeley, it becomes decisively more Republican, so it's a pretty split district, very competitive. The incumbent was Republican Barbara Kirkmeyer, but when they redrew the district, it became really a toss-up district. And the Democrat, Caraveo, won the seat. You can see she did not get 50% of the vote. She got 48.38% of the vote, but that was the most. So she won the seat. That's how most seats are awarded to the U.S. House of Representatives, state houses, state senate, and again, electoral college, even across the United States. There are some benefits to this system. It's simple. Whoever gets the most votes wins. That's pretty simple. The downside of this, or one of the downsides of this, is in, again, comparative election terminology, a lot of votes are wasted. And by wasted, what we mean is they don't turn into representation. So we think about the Colorado 8th, we can see the winner had 48.38% of the vote, but 51.62% of the voters effectively don't get representation, even though they really are represented by the member, but they don't get their preferred representative. And you can imagine that this is a very split district and very competitive, but you can imagine in less competitive districts, voters from the minority party might not even feel really compelled to go out and vote. Why would they? If you're a Democrat in a West Virginia district, or a Republican anywhere in Massachusetts, your chances of winning are zero. Both West Virginia seats are held by Republicans who win about 66% of the vote. All 9 seats in Massachusetts are held by Democrats, averaging somewhere between 60 and 75% of the vote. So that's a little bit of a problem. Voters don't feel happy because they kind of feel like their vote was maybe wasted. Not surprisingly, turnout is lower in first past the post systems than in other forms, in more proportional systems like we see in Europe. Belgium regularly has a turnout of over 90%. We'd kill for 90% in this country. We'd kill for 80%. You know, when we get a presidential election that breaks 70, we're like, woo!
Yeah.
You know, and in congressional midterm elections, if we break 55 or 60, we're doing okay comparatively, but we don't all the time. I've seen it low, and you know, and think about even local elections. You know, I saw a district in Westmoreland County once where there was 9% turnout for an odd year.
It's a very long day.
Yeah. I'm a judge of elections, so you'd rather have it a little busier. So why is lower turnout in these kind of election systems? Well, there are some problems. People know that it doesn't matter. Even if it's not a majority, the plurality winner doesn't have majority support, so that creates a little bit of potential suppression of why should I go vote. Maurice Duverger is a French political scientist, and when France adopted a single-member district system in the 1950s, France, within about 3 election cycles, had gone from a pretty robust multi-party system into a 2-party system. And he said, look, this is one of the problems with single-member district systems, is they tend to morph into 2-party systems. The parties that win are going to be your big center-right, your big center-left party. They're always going to finish first or second, and smaller parties get punished. So we call this Duverger's law. A 2-party system is extraordinarily likely to emerge from this kind of system. Less moderate candidates can win. In heavily partisan districts, the primary is really what decides who's going to win. And a more radical or a more reactionary candidate could win in that primary and then likely win the election. It depends very heavily on the state, on the district, but that is certainly one of the possibilities. And of course, voters then become dissatisfied. Not everybody fits into the 2-party model. Not everybody necessarily agrees with the party or the candidate that wins. And again, they feel their vote really wasn't that meaningful or representative of what they wanted. One of the other problems is you can get very disproportionate results. Parties overall can be over or underrepresented in the legislature. And when I go to the next slide, I'll show that. But ultimately, what a party might get nationwide does not equal the number of seats they're going to get. So if we go back to 2012 in the United States, A very close election. Nationwide, Democratic candidates won 48.8% of the vote. Republican candidates won 47.6% of the vote. But the Republicans won 234 seats, Democrats 201. The Republicans held control of the House of Representatives, despite the fact they got lost votes nationwide. But it's not a nationwide vote. It's 435 district votes. What that meant is that the Republicans probably won a fair number of close races. It also means Democrats probably won a number of races by big margins, but they still only got one seat. It doesn't matter if you win a seat by one vote or a million votes, you only get one seat. So Britain just had an election on July 4th. The UK, the Labour Party under Sir Keir Starmer had a huge landslide victory over the incumbent Conservative Party. They won 63.2% of the seats in the House of Commons. But actually nationwide, they only got about 33.7% of the vote. The LDP, which is the biggest third party, typically gets around 12 to 15% of the vote, but they only really won about 11% of the seats, so they're kind of semi-underrepresented. So what we can see here is that, some parties get overrepresented, some parties get underrepresented. It's not very proportional to what the vote total is on a national level. Of course, we can look at that at a state level in the United States. In fact, the last couple of congressional elections in the United States have actually been pretty proportional. If you kind of look at 2016, 2020, 2022, or 2018, 2020, 2022, the results are incredibly proportional, which is just random. But statewide, it's not very proportional. So again, we can look at West Virginia. West Virginia only has 2 districts now. They used to have 3 after 2020 because of declining population. They're down to 2 seats. But both seats were won by Republicans. That's not particularly surprising in West Virginia. It's a very strong Republican stronghold. If you combine the 2 candidates together, they won 66% of the seats. Democrats won 66% of the vote. Democrats won 31% of the vote. But Republicans get 100% of the seats. They didn't get 100% of the vote, but they get 100% of the seats. They won both districts. Massachusetts is sort of the flip. Democratic candidates won almost 70% of the vote statewide. Republicans 29, almost 30%. But again, Democrats won 100% of the seats. So even if it looks proportional at the national level, at the state level, it never really does. And we could look at a lot of other states that kind of fit that bill. But that's because we have this district system. And of course, the district system has other problems. Every 10 years, because people move, populations grow in some areas, decline in other areas, we do a census. The census is actually in the Constitution. We have to do it every 10 years. The first one was done in 1790. It's been done every 10 years since, even in the middle, 1940, even as war was on, we were on the verge of war, they did a census. They always do a census. That was why it was hard during 2020 because of COVID. But they do it because that drives where the seats in Congress are going to be distributed. Every 10 years, the census is done. We look where population has grown, where it's declined, and then we redraw the congressional maps. Every district should have about the same number of people in it. It's about 700,000-ish. You can never draw it perfectly. In addition, districts can't run over state boundaries, so states with less than 700,000, Wyoming, I'm looking your way, you still get one full seat even though you don't have 700,000 people. Same for Alaska. They have 1 at-large seat in the House of Representatives, but they get 2 senators. So that's kind of, that's interesting. But in any case, so every 10 years you got to redraw the districts. That's called apportionment and then reapportionment. How are you going to apportion all the seats? And of course that happens at the state level too. We do it for the state house and state senate. And every state basically does that to some extent. So redistricting, when you draw those borders, of course, can be done in an unfair way that favors particular candidates or parties. We know this, it's called gerrymandering. If you've lived in Pennsylvania for any longer period of time, we were one of the most gerrymandered states historically in the United States, with some of the weirdest looking districts, which were drawn intentionally either to be to break up Republican or Democratic votes, to be dominantly Democratic or Republican and make them safe. That was done for decades and decades, really, a couple centuries, until the state Supreme Court ruled that gerrymandering was actually unconstitutional in Pennsylvania. And so the redrawing the districts now, the districts don't look as weird as they did. I mean, you used to have these weird districts that would, there were ones called the chicken or, the dragon, that would cross like 8 counties, but along highways, that's as wide as it would be in some points. They're much better drawn now, but they still, there's debates over how we draw them, which still has a lot to do with political favoritism. So that's one of the downsides of single-member district systems as well, is that the way you draw all those 435 districts and all the state house and state senate districts matters tremendously as well. So the other option that's used in some US states is the 2-ballot or runoff system. So this requires 50% of the vote plus 1. If somebody gets that, they win. If nobody gets that, a week, a month, 2 weeks, who knows, it's different in different states. You'll hold a runoff election between a more limited number of candidates. This is how they elect the French president. They have a nationwide election for president. They have a bunch of different candidates, really, but Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen, this was the last election in 2019, yeah. Macron finished first, but well below 50%. So it was going to go to a runoff. Macron wins fairly easily in that runoff election and has guaranteed 50% plus mandate to be able to govern as the French president for the next 5 years. The French National Assembly does this as well, so their lower house elects people the same way. It's divided into 677 districts, and they do the same thing. Very few people win on the first ballot. They eliminate a bunch of the low-getting candidates, and then have a runoff election among the remaining candidates, and whoever gets the most wins. In the United States, several states use runoff elections. It's also used at the local and municipal level frequently as well. I can't even go on all the versions of that exist. But the big users are Georgia, Mississippi, Louisiana. Georgia has used runoff elections since the 1960s. They use it for congressional seats, state governors, lieutenant governors, almost most state executive offices, state legislative races. And so in Georgia it works that the top, if nobody gets 50% plus 1, the top 2 advance to an election held 4 weeks after the general election. So, elections are November 5th. Sometime in 4 weeks later, on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in December, there will be elections in Georgia if there's any need to have runoff elections. Mississippi's only used runoff since 2020. They use it for all statewide elections, so governor, attorney general, those kind of races. The top 2 advance to a runoff 3 weeks after the general election. So again, states can pick whatever rules they want under this. Louisiana is probably one of the most notable as well. They've used runoff elections since 1975. All local, state, federal offices are typically up for grabs as a runoff election. The top 2 advance. And interestingly, they could be from the same party. Louisiana doesn't limit who runs in the first round. So typically you can sometimes see 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans and then a bunch of smaller candidates, and nobody gets even close to 50%. But then you might have a runoff of 2 Republicans or 2 Democrats, which is weird. But Louisiana's different. So in fact, all 50 states are different, which is one of the interesting things about them. So those are for general elections. Primary elections, a number of states use them in primary elections. So Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Mississippi, North Carolina, Oklahoma, South Carolina, South Dakota, and Texas all use runoff elections in primaries. Georgia, Mississippi, and Louisiana, they even have open primaries where you don't have to affiliate with a particular party to be able to go vote in the primary election. So that adds an even additional wrinkle into primaries. And most of them have basically the same rule. Runoff is required if nobody gets 50% plus 1. It's typically the top 2. In North Carolina and South Dakota, it's a much lower threshold. If nobody gets 30 or 35%, and there's at least 3 candidates, then they move on. So, again, every state can put its own little wrinkle and spin on it, and that's perfectly fine under the Constitution. It's still a single-member district system. They're just generally working so that the results have, the person that wins has 50% plus support. actual majority support, ultimately. So the advantages are that it elects a more preferred candidate with a majority support rather than just plurality. It might eliminate more radical candidates in favor of more moderates because you have this runoff. Just because somebody gets 45% of the vote doesn't, if one person is a little more radical or a little more what the locals think is crazy, but still finished strong, that second ballot allows people to go, well, we're going to go with the less crazy one, right? The more moderate, the more reasonable candidate, especially if they don't care about party affiliation. That depends, though. There's a lot of studies done on this, and it depends on how high is turnout, the district itself, what state it's in. There's so many variables. You can't guarantee that that's going to happen. The state and the district matter a lot. And in fact, some of the research that originally said this always creates moderation, there's a lot of evidence that shows it depends on a bunch of other factors. For third-party candidates, and for people who support third parties or not the top two candidates, this could provide an advantage as well, which on that first round of voting, you can go vote your conscience. You vote your conscience and say, hey, I'm actually a supporter of the Libertarian Party or the Green Party. I'm going to vote for that candidate because that's who I really want. Now, they didn't win. Nobody got 50% plus one. You go in 4 weeks later and vote, and now you can vote more strategically, what we call, strategic voting. Vote for who's closest to you. Maybe the Libertarian votes Republican, maybe the Green Party votes Democrat. But you didn't really waste your vote, which is what happens with third-party voting frequently in first-past-the-post systems. So voters might be more satisfied. They see it as more choice, more options, that somebody's got to garner 50% plus one support ultimately to win that seat. There are deficits. Runoff elections mean that election officials, the elections precincts and everything have to be open again. Imagine if we had to work twice in November and December for a runoff election.
No, thank you.
That can be really expensive for state and local election offices and ultimately taxpayers. Because we have to pay for this crap. Right? So that's one downside. The campaigns then, especially if it's for big races, Senate races, governor races, they're going to be throwing a lot of money. You think there's a lot of ads prior to November 5th. Imagine if you have a runoff election. We just saw this 2 years ago. The runoff election between Herschel Walker and Warnock in Georgia. Neither got 50%. They moved on to the runoff election 4 weeks later. In just that 4 weeks, they spent $125 million more. 4 weeks. If you're part of the Republican Democratic Party in that 4 week period, you got lots of emails. Give these people money. If you lived in Georgia, you got 4 more weeks of ads on television and the internet and everything like that. I don't think that's a benefit. In the end, though, who still wins? It still tends to be a two-party system. Republicans and Democrats still almost win all of these seats in runoff races. Again, if you're a third-party supporter, maybe you're still dissatisfied. There's still a lot of wasted votes. Even if that person gets 50% plus one, 49.9% of the population are still, this sucks. Right? It's still a district magnitude of 1. There's still only one seat for that district. That's their representative. There's other issues, right? So, if there's long lines, how do you get absentee and mail-in ballots out in 3 weeks? Or 4 weeks even, challenging for a runoff election. Georgia really struggles to do that sometimes. Many of the other states do as well. There's also this thing called voter fatigue we sometimes see. There are some states, by the way, municipalities where you really vote 4 or 5 times a year. And there's also evidence that you tend to see lower voter turnout in a lot of those elections because people, they don't have a problem going once a year or once every 2 years, but once you start increasing higher than that, they're like, really? Another election day? This happens in Switzerland, which has lots of local, cantonal, national elections, referendum. The average Swiss citizen probably has 6 voting days a year in busy years. And they actually have slightly lower voter turnout in the United States, but I'm like, it doesn't really count. Like for their national elections, it's higher, but all those other ones, it kind of brings the number down. And I'm like, we're only voting once or twice a year, it's different. Gerrymandering's still a problem, right? This is, for the districts, you're not drawing the district, you still have to redraw the districts every, 10 years, so you still have that problem built in as well. So option number 3. So the main option, really the Australian model, is what's called the alternative vote or ranked choice voting. It's also sometimes called instant runoff or preferential voting, so it seems to have a lot of names. So what happens when you get a ballot, you rank your candidates in order from 1 to whatever you want to go to. You don't have to rank them all. You can stop at 1 if you want to. You can rank the whole way down all the candidates. Doesn't really matter. And then they use math to figure out who wins. So this is what a ballot actually looks like in Australia. So this is from the state of Victoria, the election division of Higgins. So these are all the people running. So it tells you the name, what party, Green Party, Liberal, the Darren Hinch's Justice Party, Marriage Equality Party, the Labour Party, the Animal Justice Party, the Nick Xenophon Team. So you rank them in order. Well, even on our ballots, there's a bunch of small parties. There's still a prohibition party that runs candidates in Pennsylvania. There's nothing I oppose more than that party. That might have been partisan. I should have said.
Yeah.
Sorry, I apologize to any prohibition party people in the stands or in the room. So the thing here is if nobody gets 50%, so they count preferences. So they count how many first preference votes did this candidate get. If somebody gets 50% plus 1, they win. It's over, the election's done. So you count first choice voters, somebody's got a majority, you got a winner, you're done. Well, what if nobody has 50% plus 1? So what you do is you discriminate eliminated candidates' ballots. You pick the person who got the least. Okay, candidate, let's say Jessica from the Darren Heights Justice Party finished last, and she got 500 votes. You eliminate her from the ballot. And then you pretend like she didn't even exist on the first ballot. So you look at who are the people, the 500 people that voted for her, who did they pick second? And you redistribute to their second preferences. Because that's who they wanted second most. And if their first person had never appeared on the ballot, you go with their second pick. Okay, so you redistribute. Does somebody have a majority now? Yes, so we have a winner. Somebody got enough votes now to go over 50% won. If they didn't, you'll have to eliminate the next person and redistribute, and then the next person and redistribute. In Ireland, this is sort of how they elect their president, which is mostly a ceremonial position, but I've seen it where you have to eliminate 4 candidates until somebody wins. So that can happen. So the goal here is much like runoff systems. You want to get somebody with majority support. Somebody that got 50% plus 1 of the population prefers. So a number of states now use ranked choice voting. The biggies are Maine and Alaska. Maine adopted this in 2018, so all statewide primaries, congressional and presidential elections used ranked choice voting. In Alaska, they just adopted this in 2020. Statewide races, congressional, presidential, state house, state senate. But theirs is even different. After the primary election, the top 4 winners all advance to the general. And then you use ranked choice, so people actually can have 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans, or 3 Republicans and a Democrat to choose from and vote. And then you rank order them the way you want to. Nevada's is pending. Nevada, the state legislature let it go through. There was a referendum in 2022, and it has to get approved twice. So there was a first referendum, and now there's a second referendum on the ballot this November. And if it goes through again, then they will have ranked choice voting starting in 2026. It'll be for all statewide offices, so governor, all federal offices, so House and Senate. Similar to Alaska, the top 5 candidates from the primary advance to the general election, and then you can rank choice order them. So that can be from multiple political parties appearing on the general election ballot. They also did kind of a test run. The Nevada Democratic Party in 2020 ran the presidential primaries a ranked choice voting model. So kind of as a test. Parties can actually do this in a lot of states too. Republican and Democratic parties for their primaries can choose a ranked choice voting model depending on state laws. Because we'll actually see that. Hawaii has used some ranked choice voting since 2022, just for special elections. So if somebody dies or resigns from office, like a House seat or a Senate seat, then they use ranked choice. But in normal elections, they wouldn't. But again, in 2020, the Democratic presidential primary was run using a ranked choice voting system. Colorado and Idaho are going to have a referendum on the ballot this year, this November, about taking the first step towards ranked choice voting. Idaho is interesting because the Idaho state legislature actually passed a law banning ranked choice voting. But citizens in these states can, through referendum, override the state legislature. It will take the legislature will eventually have to act to implement it and enforce it, but it's a possibility. New York City uses primaries for mayors. Maybe that didn't work out so well if you've been paying attention to the news. But Eric Adams gained the nomination of the Democratic Party to become the candidate for New York's mayor and won through a ranked choice voting system. I think on the first ballot he only had about 21% of the vote. But as they started eliminating all the low vote getters, he eventually, they had to vote, I think there were 16 candidates running for mayor on the Democratic ticket in the primary, so it was a really spread out vote, and he eventually won. But they used that for some other offices as well. Kansas and Wyoming, the Democratic Party also did an experiment in 2020 using ranked choice voting for presidential primaries. So it's been, it's not exactly commonplace, but on the other hand, it's not exactly, a unicorn at this point. Plus, I'm not even mentioning municipalities. Hundreds of municipalities and municipal governments and counties across the United States use variants of ranked choice voting. So it's really not that uncommon. It's a little less common for congressional seats and statewide seats, but it's really not that common of a system overall in the United States or Canada. Many municipalities in Canada use ranked choice voting systems as well. So Maine, I'll give you an example of how this sort of works. Maine is divided into 2 congressional districts because it's a small, not very populous, well, it's a big state territorially, small state population. So District 2 is the big one in the north. District 1 is down around the major cities in southern Maine. So if we kind of look at their 2 races, Maine District 1, this is 2022 results. Shelley Pingree, Democrat, pretty easily won that seat, won 63% to the Republican 37%. Won that seat pretty easily. So they didn't even have to use ranked choice voting because first preference, 63%, they won. The second district's always been a bit more competitive. The last 2 elections have both had to use ranked choice voting to determine the winner. So in the first round, Jared Golden, who's the incumbent Democrat, took 48% of the vote. Bruce Poliquin, who used to be the Congress member 2 terms ago, finished in second with 44% of the vote. So nobody got 50% plus 1. Tiffany Bond, who ran as an independent 2 years ago and 4 years ago, ran again. She got 6.9% of the vote. So nobody got 50% plus 1. So there were some write-ins, so they get rid of those first, and if anybody had a second preference, they redistributed them, but it wasn't really going to make enough to make a difference. But they eventually eliminated Tiffany Bond, so that's 21,655 votes. They looked at those ballots, who did their voters pick second, and then redistributed those votes. And when they did that, Golden exceeded 50% plus 1, won the seat. That's actually exactly what happened in 2020, as well as 2022. So that's how it worked at the state level, kind of a typical example.
So,
yeah, so.
when Tiffany transferred like 21,000 votes, that didn't all transfer because I'm assuming there was no second choice. for
Some
them?
people didn't pick a second choice.
choice.
Maybe their second choice was a write-in or even a third or fourth party candidate,
Okay.
whereas,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah. So they wouldn't necessarily go, right. So again, it's only if you give that second preference.
Right.
So, yeah.
Okay.
So Alaska began using this as well. This was actually a pretty well-known election in 2022. So they had the primary. 4 candidates made essentially the general election. And, you know, there were also a lot of write-ins. So 1 Democrat, 2 Republicans, including former Governor Sarah Palin, who was vice presidential candidate, Nick Begich, who was a Republican, but decisively anti-Palin. So the Republicans in Alaska were sort of split between these 2 very different candidates. And then Chris Bai, who ran, I think, as a libertarian. So, you know, they eliminated all the small, you know, people who had a lot of write-in votes or nothing, or were eliminated from the primary to the secondary. And there were some. So then they eliminated Chris Bai's votes. And once you eliminated Chris Bai's votes, they redistributed these 4,986 to the next preferences. Still, nobody had 50% plus 1. Peltola, the Democrat, was at 49.2, pretty close. But then the next lowest vote getter was Begich. So when Begich was eliminated, the people that voted for Begich, despite the fact they were Republicans, their second preference wasn't always Palin. And in fact, they voted Democrat for their second preference. So Mary Peltola became the first Democrat representing Alaska in a while, and won the seat and won re-election actually as well. So because she had to run in a special election because Murkowski retired, and there was a runoff. You know, they had to fill an election, and so that's how it worked in Alaska. But she was actually the one with majority support, majority preference. Some people complained this isn't really democratic. I'm like, actually, a key part of democracy is majority support. So you could make an argument that it's actually more democratic than first past the post systems, where, yeah, you might have the most, but you don't even have a majority plus 1 support.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
How long does it take from when the election takes place till you knew that Mary won?
Not that long. Now, a lot of ranked choice places use paper balloting. Some use electronic. You do electronic, it's really fast. You can actually run it through the system really quick. You do have to double check everything, but it does all the math for you. So for this one, I think it was almost 2 days.
So that's not bad. Yeah.
No. In the ranked choice voting system in Ireland, usually you got to wait about 3 days for the final results to come in. But yeah, usually you have a good idea early. So the advantages is when you go in to vote, you can vote for your most preferred candidate, whoever it is, and you're not going to have that spoiler effect. If you support the Green Party, the Libertarian Party, or some independent, go ahead and vote. Vote for them as their first preference. They're probably going to get eliminated somewhere along the line, and then your second preference gets counted. So, you know, you can still vote your heart. You don't have to do that strategic voting or sometimes what we call hold your nose voting, right? So there's no spoiler effect. Does that make voters turn out a little bit higher? Does it make them happier? Maybe. There's some evidence that suggests it does. It's more economical than the runoff 2 ballot because you don't have to do another election 3 weeks or 4 weeks or 5 weeks later. It's an instant runoff. It is cheaper, easier, and you're going to have a result in a winner in a couple of days. Top candidates then have to try to appeal to a wider range of voters. Right? Mary Peltola in Alaska, she might have been running as a Democrat, but she worked hard to reach across to moderate Republicans and say, look, you know, I'm of native descent, I live here, I have some of the same concerns you have. Make me your second pick, or your third pick. And enough did that, so you have to cater to a wider chunk of the electorate. That's probably good. It claims to reduce polarization and more extremist candidates who don't then win. It's possible. There's some evidence to suggest that. I mean, we could look as Palin as one of the more extremer ones in Alaska in that race potentially, and that did eliminate her. There are some claims that it helps minority women or candidates of color, but I've seen and read enough evidence that points to losses for women and minority candidates and people of color that it's a mixed bag of evidence. And again, it might really depend on the state, the district, local conditions. There's 100 other variables that can explain it other than just the election system. It claims to reduce negative campaigning because if you run totally negative campaigning, again, trying to appeal to that broader range that maybe spans parties or more moderate, the moderates are the ones that tend to hate negative campaigning more. Partisans don't mind it. Well, they hate it from the other side, but they don't mind it as much from their own side. So maybe that's not so terrible either, if we think about it. There are disadvantages. Maybe it's less clear than first past the post or even runoff. You do have to rank order. Some people, we've seen a certain number of ballots where they only list one and then they don't vote anymore. And then if that person's eliminated, they're not really getting that vote counted later. Again, more time to count ballots. It could take much longer depending on how many candidates you have to eliminate, how close the race are you going to have to recount. It's still a single member district system, so you can still gerrymander it, not in Alaska because they only have one district, but that makes it easy. Alaska, Wyoming, Idaho until recently. Idaho, let me go back and figure that out, which states added. No, that's the one. Yeah, Montana was the one that added a seat, not Idaho yet. So, but Idaho's population is growing, so they could be adding a seat at some point. Having just one makes it a little easier. You don't really have to worry about redistricting at all. Still district magnitude of 1. So you're still only getting one person per district, so there's still wasted votes. In Alaska, still 47% of the people didn't get a candidate they wanted. That's still pretty high. As I said, some people have made studies that show that it hurts minority women or candidates of color. Ultimately, we still see a two-party system. We have occasionally seen independents win in places like Maine. But for the most part, if we look at ranked choice voting and even the runoff elections, Republicans and Democrats win all the seats. So if you're a third-party supporter, it's still, you're like, this still sucks. Right? So you still get that higher wasted vote. So why is there a big push for this now? Over the last, especially 10 years, I'd say 10 to 15 years, we've seen increasing talk about ranked choice voting and other options. Well, the public seems dissatisfied. Their trust in Congress is at really low numbers, historically low. Trust in government overall is low. Americans see government at the state and national level as less responsive, less accountable. As American public is polarized, we have a bigger far left, a bigger far right. We still have a center that's a little smaller than it used to be. Maybe the two-party system doesn't match us quite as well as it did 40 or 50 or 100 years ago. Voter turnout. Again, people are concerned about voter turnout, and it's hard to get people to turn out if they don't feel like that their voice is going to be heard. So again, we see higher turnout in certain election systems with more choice, less wasted votes. Again, maybe less strategic hold your nose voting in ranked choice. A lot of the states that have adopted it have also been big proponents of what's called direct democracy, referenda, ballot initiatives of citizens. For instance, the one in Idaho, the only reason that's on the ballot are citizens. Citizens got enough petition signatures to get that on the ballot. The state legislature didn't want it, but Idaho's citizens wanted it. So states that use direct democracy and referendum, and that's more Western states than Eastern states, are probably more likely to see these kind of potential changes, or at least getting on the ballot of thinking about it. And the other interesting thing is, again, we don't really have one national election system. We have 50 election systems for the House and the Senate, And even the way we calculate electoral votes for president, it's really 50 races. So in many ways, this is kind of a classic laboratory of democracy. States can experiment. The states and their citizens say, hey, let's try this. And if it doesn't turn out so well, they go, okay, can we go back to the old system or try something else? Or they can say, this is fine. It was kind of funny in Alaska after the results. Some people were complaining, but Alaskan citizens themselves approved this measure. It's not like it came out of nowhere. It's not like the state foisted it upon them. They voted for that system overwhelmingly. It was like 70% approval when it went through on referendum. And you're like, you asked for this system, you got it, Toyota. This is what you got. So, that's an advantage. It's actually one of the constitutional advantages of the United States is that we have a system where you can experiment in one state, see if it works, and then try it in your state. You don't always have to be the first one to run through the wall.
Has anybody ever gone to it and gone back?
Not so far. Some municipalities have changed. Some municipalities have gone to ranked choice voting, and then they moved mostly back to runoff systems. They didn't go the whole way back. So, yeah. So, I would say that, other things, again, still dominated by a two-party system. You still get wasted votes. You still have gerrymandering problems. Well, not Alaska. You still might get disproportionate results. Again, depending on the state and the district, maybe it moderates candidates, maybe it doesn't. Some states are less moderate, are more far left and far right. So the candidates that are going to win are still going to reflect that state most likely. There are limits to what an election system can do to moderate the candidates or their positions. And it's still a district magnitude of 1, and I've repeated that several times because I'm a much bigger proponent of proportional systems, which are used in countries like the Netherlands, Israel, Germany, Belgium. In fact, most European states use a more proportional system, Italy. Or the Irish system, which uses a multi-member district system. Ireland's divided into districts, and each district elects between 3 and 5 members from each district. So the most preferred one is going to get there, but the second and third ones are too. And so it tends to represent more parties. And it ends up looking a lot more proportional. If some party and candidate got about 20% of the vote, they're probably going to get a seat. So, I like those systems because they are much more representative of what the voters actually wanted. Ireland's would probably work better in the United States too because it's still a district system. People like having local constituencies and a local person representing their district. And in fact, they get 3 of them or 5 of them. So if you don't like what one guy says, go see Patty down the way. He might listen to you. The problem here is our Constitution now. The Constitution does mandate a district system with 1 person per district. So states are somewhat constrained to those kind of 3 different choices, but there's lots of wrinkles even within those choices. And in fact, there's probably some unimagined options out there even as well in which states can start thinking about ways to be maybe a little more proportional, but those would end up having to get tested in the court very likely, and it's harder to say. And those are less likely maybe. The big ones right now are ranked choice or runoff elections. Are they better than our existing system? In some ways. It again depends what you prioritize and what your preference, right? If you want less wasted votes, you want candidates that win with at least a majority level support, you want to get rid of some of the spoiler effect, maybe get some moderation of candidates. Candidates have to reach out across to a wider range of voters. Ranked choice and even runoff elections might do that a little bit better than our existing system. But it doesn't solve every problem. So that is my presentation. I'll take any questions. Yes.
Okay, so with your general election,
Yeah.
you go in and you kind of, aren't you already ranking who you want? You're voting for your favorite candidate.
Right.
So,
But what if your favorite candidate's not going to win? What if you had a chance for a second one, right?
well, see, I just think I think we already have a choice we're already ranking in my mind, because I'm voting for who I want to win. Or if I feel like, okay, Joe Schmo, okay, he's an independent, he hasn't campaigned, he's probably only gonna get 10%. So I already have, in a sense, eliminated him
Right.
and chose the candidate that I
Yeah,
most likely agree with.
you always have the chance to have your most preferred candidate, but you know, let's say Joe
But you
Schmo,
might
independent, people really like him, but the chance of him winning in our system is zero.
But even so, you have that choice
Right.
rather than extending it and more time and more money. We can't get people to go out to vote. So how, I just can't see making them go again. And then
A lot of the polling data shows that some people don't vote because they don't have that number of choices they would like, and because their vote does get wasted at a higher percentage than in other systems. And we can just look at turnout rates from the United States compared to virtually every other system.
Well, if
and
my candidate doesn't win, I feel my vote was wasted by choice. You know what I mean?
Right.
So I can feel that way.
Right, but that's what happens then if you're in a majority Republican or Democratic district.
But
You know, it helps suppress that vote even more, because then why even go vote?
because that's my constitution right.
Sure, but
And I'm going to do it, and I don't want anyone stopping me, whether my candidate wins or loses.
But there's also an economics to it. A lot of people have said this is why long waiting lines are terrible at the poll.
But we
Once it's
have-
long,
But now you have mail-in voting
mail-in voting's an improvement, I would argue.
is because and then.
Early voting, mail-in voting.
Yeah,
We're the
well-
only, by the way, we're the only advanced democracy that votes on a weekday. Everybody else does it on Saturdays and
So with
Sundays.
the general election, it's kind of like saying, if you go with that other system, like they want to know the results that day.
Yeah,
But
but we're
they-
not even getting that for presidential
But
elections
I mean,
anymore, so
I-
we
I
can be
have- we have
patient.
other
but-
questions.
And I
here.
personally, my feeling is, I don't think it's right that we tell the West Coast what our results are, because that can influence their voting. That's my personal.
That's always been actually an issue for presidential elections.
One of the problems that I've run into over the years is people just get tired of all of the constant campaigning and the asking for donations.
Yeah, we have a very expensive
I
system
lived
too.
for a few years in England.
Yeah.
They announce an election, and you got 6 weeks to campaign.
Right.
6 weeks.
Not only that, television and other advertising is banned the last
Right.
like 10 days.
Yeah, right. This is what
You can watch your shows in
I
peace.
love this idea. And in fact, I've always, until this year, waited till 30 days before the election before sticking yard signs out.
Right.
This year, my wife said, get them out there.
Yeah, I mean, you know, they go up earlier, the process starts earlier, it's more
But
expensive.
it's just the
The
constant.
I mean, you know, in most other advanced democracies as well, elections are publicly funded, so campaigning is publicly funded. There are limits on how much you can spend. You can only give a certain amount of money. You can only spend it in certain ways. Our system, the court ruled in the 70s, Buckley v. Vallejo, that money is speech. And the dilemma with that is it creates this open-ended, you know, every election is like, this will be the most expensive election in history until the next election, right? I mean, we're gonna see, what, presidential election, I think they were saying $5 billion this year in, you know, spending from the candidates, but then issue advertising outside. $5 billion's a lot of money.
It's actually wonderful if you're the advertiser.
Yeah, it's good for newspapers and
That's what I did- that's what I
telecommunications
did for
companies
another
and
company.
Facebook and X and others are gonna make a killing.
Or the-
An army of a killing.
Or the bagman carrying the money.
I had a question. So with the current climate, and people feeling like our elections aren't as transparent enough, have there been any complaints about going to ranked choice of voting? Because it seems very complicated.
You know, we already have inspectors from most parties, as well as anybody else can actually apply to be inspector in most states and go view the process. In Ireland, it's super transparent with the ranked voting system, and they do, you know, they still use all paper ballots in Ireland, and you know, and even in Alaska and
hard to
you know,
hack that.
Maine, they've done it. So it's sort of like Oregon, you know, which has been doing mail-in ballot. That's the only way to vote in Oregon is by mail-in ballot. There's no polling place to go to. They save a lot of money, so I wouldn't have to go in on election day. They'd save me that day. But you know, there's all kinds of costs in economics to voting. And people do calculate those things, especially younger voters, but other voters as well that aren't, people that aren't decisively partisan, right? Partisan people are much more likely to go out and vote, but people who are middle of the road or not sure, if they see a long line, if they're unsure that their vote will really count, they're less likely to actually go and do it. Yeah.
So just to make sure I understand how the rank system works, is that there's no additional voting. You give out one ballot.
One ballot.
That ballot's processed
First
different
choice,
ways
second
depending
choice.
on whether you're first round, second round.
Yep.
All right, so there's no additional visits to the polls or whatever.
No. One day.
Okay. So then, but the other thing then in those terms of people, counties, their systems are automated.
Yeah.
So those, the redistribution then is then automatic.
Yeah, so each of the ballots is scanned, so each ballot's scanned, so we know this group were for candidate number 5, they're eliminated. For the automated ones, the scanners pick up, okay, who was their second pick, and then redistribute those ballots to those particular candidates, and they go from there. In Ireland, they put them in boxes. I've actually seen pictures where they, you know, they like, okay, these were for this person, but they were out. So then they have to put them in different piles for their second pick, and then go put those in the pile, and then they count them.
So obviously the runoff system is one that's more expensive, where you have to have another election day.
Yeah, I would argue you might as well skip that, go right straight to ranked choice if you're going to do it and save that, especially in again states that are very competitive, where that's going to be a narrow margin, where it's going to happen a lot. It's really expensive to do those things for the candidates as well as for the states. Yeah.
Can you use this system to vote against somebody?
Sure, you could obviously not rank them at all. You know, they're going to be at the bottom, and you can even pick people that are close to them, let's say ideologically or a party, and like especially if there's more than one candidate from the same party, like in Alaska, you could you could do that to punish a particular candidate if they're their least preferred and you hate them and don't want to get any vote. Yeah, absolutely.
Last question, maybe.
Are you or maybe anyone else here hearing rumblings about that any of ranked choice voting for any level of Pennsylvania?
I haven't seen any. It's not, the state legislature and state constitution don't expressly prohibit it. So the upside is the state legislature could do it on its own. Most likely they would kick it as a voter referendum, my guess is, because they don't want to get blamed for it. They go, hey, you guys picked it. You know, they can do that, so that would be my guess.
That would be good, because
Yeah.
people would know what they're signing up for.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Well, we're starting to run out of time, so thanks everybody.
Yeah.
If you have additional questions, you can catch me on the way out, but I'm in Pickeringsburg. You can email me, try to get in touch with me there as well. Thanks a lot.
Thank you all for coming.
One last thing, I forgot to do that. I'm going to say at the beginning, these opinions are mine and mine alone as a professional political scientist, not the League of Women Voters, not the University of Pittsburgh Greensburg, not the library. I wanted to say that at the beginning, but you know, yeah, so.
You know, other than that hit on the prohibition.
Oh, thanks a lot. Thanks. Yeah, we'll save that for, I know, we'll save that for December. Thank you.
It just,
Well, that's tomorrow. Yeah, whatever.
Thanks.
You know,
I did have some questions.
interesting. I think they're pretty good. But other eyes.
Yeah, so the top four.
Not bad, yourself?
From the primary,
Oh,
so
no,
what that
no,
showed
no,
was all the people who were on the primary, but the ones